Aperture.
I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to say thank you to Chris Booth, the director of Aperture Foundation, for proving that I left on good terms and allowing me to host the event here, as well as to Barbara Escobar and her team for helping me coordinate today's program. So my task today is relatively straightforward. I'm just going to outline the territory that I hope we cover, introduce our esteemed guests, and then moderate the conversation that follows their individual remarks. But first, while I have a captive audience, I'd like to speak briefly about the impetus for today's event. This weekend, many Cincinnati arts organizations have descended upon New York as part of a festival called Cincy and NYC. Our symphony is performing at Carnegie Hall, our ballet is over on 8th Avenue at the Joyce, and other organizations are also here in town. This event is the Cincinnati Art Museum's contribution to that festival. And again, as Barbara said, it's related to my first exhibition at the Art Museum, also titled Eyes on the Street. The exhibition's opening in October coincides with another festival. This one is called Photo Focus, which, as the name suggests, is specifically about photography. This will be the second edition of the biennial celebration and will feature photography exhibitions at approximately 50 venues throughout Cincinnati and the region. There will also be a program of artist lectures, panels, film screenings, and other events during its opening weekend, which is October 8th through October 12th. The festival actually features several connections to Aperture, including an exhibition at the Contemporary Art Center of Aperture favorites Tayo Honorado and Nico Krebs, the Swiss artist duo. The photographs that you see around you here by Richard Rinaldi will be repurposed and presented throughout town on bus shelters as part of a public art project in Cincinnati. And we'll also present Rob Hornstra and Arnold Van Bruggen's Sochi project, which many of you may know is a book that Aperture published last year in advance of the Olympics in Sochi. We hope you'll consider joining us in Ohio for this exciting event. So, Eyes on the Street is, first, an attempt to broaden the conventional understanding of street photography. And I'm glad to be joined today by two artists whose work is included in the show, as well as an art historian/curator whose just published book also reconsiders the subject. The show brings together 10 internationally renowned artists who work in photography, film, and video. Each uses the camera's technical capabilities to reveal new aspects of the urban environment, to show us what we cannot see with our eyes or simply might not notice. The artists use, to take a few examples, strobe flashes, high-speed and high-definition cameras, double exposures, cameras synchronized by radio frequency, or appropriated surveillance camera footage to make their art. The resulting photographs, films, and videos are far from what we think of as street photography, which is still conventionally tied to mid-20th century efforts of artists like Henri Cartier-Bresson or Gary Winogrand. Our distance in time from that mid-century moment presents other avenues for discussion. In addition to rethinking the genre, I'm curious about what street photography means in the drastically changed social, technological, and demographic environment of the 21st century city. Today, popular and media discussions about cameras in public places tend to revolve around surveillance, repression, and First Amendment rights. Particularly after the events of September 11th, 2001, legal and social norms concerning public space, privacy, safety, and the ownership of images have been in flux. All of this impacts what everyone, artists included, can do with cameras in urban environments. So I'll limit myself to just saying a few things. I believe that this popular discussion has been a little bit too narrow and that it misses at least two key points. First, the shift in consciousness created by the omnipresence of cameras and the networks and computing power that they are connected to, I don't believe has been fully integrated into discussions regarding the permissibility of taking pictures in public places. And second, discussion of street photography and of urban imagery more generally is often divorced from what makes urban sites urban, such as their particular spatial characteristics or the density of people and interactions that they foster. This shades into some of the ideas expressed in Kate Bussard's book, so I'll stop here just to introduce our guests. First, the artists. Philip-Lorca diCorcia, as many of you know, is a photographer whose work has been exhibited extensively for 3 decades and is in the collections of dozens of major museums around the world. Last year, the Schön Kunsthalle in Frankfurt, Germany, presented a major survey of his photographs. Other significant recent presentations include a 2008 exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and a 2007 show at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Boston. A third edition of his popular book, A Storybook Life, was recently printed, and his other books include 11, 1,000, and two that will be the subject of his remarks today, Streetwork and Heads. James Nares, our second speaker, arrived in New York in 1974 and quickly became an important member of the city's no-wave art scene. He made experimental films, played in bands, and staged live performances. He later turned to painting, a medium to which he brought his penchant for experimentation. Today he makes both paintings and films, including Street, which premiered at the Wadsworth Atheneum in 2012, before being exhibited to wide acclaim at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last spring. Like diCorcia, his exhibition history and his list of public collections comprises many museums around the world. And just a few weeks ago, Rizzoli published a comprehensive monograph of his work. It's like that thick. It's a great-looking book. And then last but not least, Katherine A. Bussard is the Peter C. Bunnell Curator of Photography at the Princeton University Art Museum. Prior to joining the museum last year, she was Associate Curator of Photography at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she had worked since 2004. Among her many exhibitions are Color Rush, American Color Photography from Stieglitz to Sherman, which was co-curated with Lisa Hostetler and which was accompanied by a catalog published by none other than Aperture. She received her PhD from the City University of New York's Graduate Center. She's currently working on a major exhibition and book titled The City Dynamic, Representing Crisis and Renewal in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980. And she's also the author of the book Unfamiliar Streets, the photographs of Richard Avedon, Charles Moore, Martha Rosler, and Philip-Lorca diCorcia, just out from Yale University Press. So, I'm delighted to bring these three people whose work I admire and enjoy together, and we'll hear from them in the order that I've introduced them. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Philip-Lorca diCorcia.
I don't know why people go to things at 11 o'clock on a Saturday. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here, but obviously the topic has been defined, and I'm just going to react to the pictures that I see in front, which are, you know, I call this one the Lion King for very obvious reasons. I don't really know. It's strange. I just heard that James was like at the Wadsworth Atheneum. I'm from Hartford, so not many people know that. I'm just changing the subject, really. But yes, I don't talk to any of these people. I think it's strange. I gave a talk in London recently, and someone came up to me, in Berlin too, and said, you know, why don't you, what's the matter with you? You don't, is there something missing because you actually have no contact with any of the people? And I'm kind of thinking that probably there is some common denominator in street photography which has to do with the fact that you just use these people. I mean, it's not that bad, but that guy with the cigarette, he actually got in touch with me. He got a picture out of it. But most of the time, I don't have anything to do with the people. This is in Cuba. They actually don't really even know that they're being photographed half the time. Although it's pretty obvious that there's somebody there with a big camera and a tripod, and you know, I use lights. I guess everybody figured that out. So the lights go off, but because they're, I didn't realize I was going to lecture here. You know, because it's full daylight, the difference between the light and the ambient light is very small. I mean, if you're in a dark room and you set off a big light, everybody notices it. But if in the middle of the day, when you set off a light, people just don't pay any attention to you. So I don't know why these people in Berlin or wherever were so pissed off at the fact that I don't even talk to them. But I think it's part of it is actually the reason I do it. And apropos to your remarks, I don't know how James got away with anything, but you can't do the same thing anymore. you know, they'll just stop you. Part of it is security, you know, homeland security and all that, and part of it is, you know, I had to get permission. I mean, this is in Paris, so obviously I didn't have to get permission. Like, why does anybody like this? They probably like it because they realize that, you know, they're two junkies. Nobody likes normal people, really. And this was kind of an accident. I don't even know what to say about it. You know, this is not prepared. Like, I don't know the sequence of events. It was in the transformation of Times Square that we all kind of experienced, from a kind of nasty place that was fun to a not so nice place that is not nasty. That guy owns a major fracking enterprise in Oklahoma. He got in touch with me like 4 years later, and somebody had shown him the catalog that this was published in, and he just spent a lot of money getting that photograph for his children. No kidding. I mean, I don't know who picked these particular slides out, but or transparencies or whatever they are. But yeah, he was like, I want them for my kid. Well, it's sold out. And, you know, it's kind of like, let the gallery do the rest. This is pretty obviously, this is Tokyo. And the only thing I don't like about this one is the lady looking at me. The one thing that you always try to do is not, you know, give away the idea that you're actually doing something. Like, you're not there is the idea for me. And that lady over on the left side, I guess, she's staring right at me. And this is before you could take people like that out of your photos. I don't actually don't know how to use Photoshop, but there are plenty of people that do. This is a guy who actually got in touch with me, too. Strange that I've worked on the street a lot, and there's probably been literally thousands of people that I've photographed, and there's a handful that ever got in touch with me, and this was one of them, because it was a review picture in the New York Times. So he got in touch with me. I guess what people like about it is the fact that he's the opposite of what you expect. You know, I think a big financial firm or something like that. Nice tie, too. And there you go. It's like the same place, same project. I don't know who this guy is. He never got in touch with me. But obviously he works for the Postal Service. And, you know, these pictures were published, this one and the other one were exhibited like September 12th, 2001. So, yeah, you know, there was no opening because, you know, the whole thing went on the day before. But somehow people started to associate, like, the everyman thing. Like, it had nothing to do with me. But because everybody thought, well, at that time, they thought like 50,000 people had died in the towers. But we know it was 3,000. But everybody went to that. And, you know, the reviews and all of that. People, all I'm saying is that people assume a lot. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. You know, this is like the Holden Caulfield of my photography. And if he didn't have pimples, it wouldn't be as good. You know, I wish she was my daughter, but I never talked to her. And I think he's over there.
I don't know how many people saw my film, but it was shot in a different way because I was moving the whole time. And I planned it that way because I wanted to have this sense that you're floating through a city full of semi-frozen people. And funnily enough, I thought quite long and hard about how I was going to do this and what kind of permission I would need. And I went to the mayor's office of film and television, and I said, I told them what my plan was, and they said, just go out there, do what you want to do, but stay away from bridges and tunnels. So that's what I did. I went out and I stayed away from bridges and tunnels. I was even filming past those, I forget the name of it, the demonstrations that were going on downtown. I think one reason was it was kind of easy for me, or easier, was that we were in this big SUV with all the windows blacked off, although one window open with the camera facing out. And we looked like a kind of FBI squad or something at times. And, there were times when I would have the camera, the lens was like, the front of the lens was like this size with a big hood on the thing. And I'd be pointing it right in someone's face from 3 feet away, and they wouldn't see it. And other times there'd be someone way in the back who would spot the camera. And I kind of like it when people engage the camera sometimes, because it draws me in. It kind of reminds me that I'm a sort of privileged viewer. And that it's kind of ennobling to watch these. It's kind of ennobling it's not, I don't feel like it's voyeuristic to just look at people. You can look at people and you can look at them you can look at people in a way that gives them their dignity, which I think is a kind of a great thing to do. You can also look at people and make fun of them. There are all kinds of ways of looking at people. But I thought a lot about the connotations of what I was doing, and I left with a clear conscience, if it's any. I'm sorry. This is I took photos when I first came to New York, 1974, walking around the city with a 35mm camera. I think this was a Nicormat that I arrived in the city with, and it was always by my side. And I've chosen a few of these old black and white prints to show you and to kind of bookend my career, which covers many different things. They look kind of cute, those two trucks, I thought. They may be in love. I think there's a Helen Levitt photograph that looks very similar to this. You don't see people doing washing like that much anymore. I guess all photography is capturing a moment in time. It's kind of historical by its just the virtue of what it is. It's a fragment of time. When I proposed the film that I made, I was trying to raise money, and I proposed it as I wanted to make a film to be seen 100 years from now. So, just to kind of point a finger at the possibility of it being a kind of time capsule, or that of being able to see it historically. And of course, nobody would give me the money because nobody wanted to fund a film to be seen 100 years from now. But I was serious about it. I made mention of Pompeii, I think, at some point. This is a kid on the street in Soho, I think, when it was beautiful, as PL was saying. There's a lot of movement and motion in just about everything I do. give or take a couple of trucks in the alley. And I like the swing of the bat. And it was very important for me. A lot of my early films are long tracking shots. There's one that I call Block, which is just a tracking shot of a hand traversing the wall, going down the street for one city block, just kind of feeling the block. And that's the film. And I shot it I shot it at 5 frames a second and then projected it at 5 frames a second so that it has that kind of moonwalk, fractured movement. And that's something I used quite a lot years ago because I liked the way it looked. You could extend a 3-minute roll of film to 10 minutes, and it made everything a lot cheaper. When you didn't have any money, it was a nice thing to do. But in Block, it kind of looks like that David, the Oath of the Horatii, that guy holding the swords. And it just goes click, 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 and the hand is stationary, and the wall is moving by in this sort of series of fragmented images, and it's very disorientating in a way. But it's almost the same film that I made with that high-speed camera. I don't know if any of you have seen Street, but it was shot with a high-speed camera at a very high frame rate, which slows everything way down. And the film's an hour and 1 minute long, 61 minutes, but if it were projected in real time, it would be about 2.5 minutes. So you end up with a sequence of moments, and each one they're almost like still photographs, but you see a little bit before, and you see a little bit afterwards. But they ride this kind of line between motion pictures and still photography, which I learned many things making that film, one of which I guess is common to all work with a camera, or all art in a sense, is that you bring as much to what you see as it gives you. There are many moments where I find myself, particularly when I was editing the film, making up these little narratives to go with the pictures. This person's talking to that person, but they don't like them. You can tell by that kind of thing. And I realized that it's just my invention. There's no way to know what's really going on. And it was really driven home to me with this one shot that I had of a guy walking down the street. And in the way that I had it, he's walking down the street, and he's looking at his feet like he's just so depressed. It's like the end of the world. His world is just collapsing around him, and he looks so dejected. And then at real speed, he's just glancing at his shoelaces. It's a complete fabrication on my part to think that this is an image of dejection and depression. And that was a big lesson for me. I'm sorry, I should move a little faster. This was a typical kind of sight one used to see. It's on the old West Side Highway, which was a great place to do just about anything. And I shot a couple of films up there, too. I shot one film where I was making these big concrete balls at the time, and then leaving them around the city. And I shot one rolling the concrete ball down the exit ramp to the old West Side Highway and just following it. It's the same shot, it's the same film really as Block or Street. It's like one long tracking shot. I'm not nostalgic for these days, but I love to look at them. But there's something fascinating. There was a sort of purity of the way people worked then, because there was less money around. Not that I advocate poverty. So here are some stills from Street. This is a pretty good example of just what I was talking about. you know, who knows what this guy's doing? He's wiping his forehead, or he's hiding from the camera. The showing stills from the little sequences of my film is interesting because they only work, really, in their sequential thing, you know, seeing the whole sequence makes sense of what you're looking at. So to see a still of a film of a still, here's another one. I love this moment. She's pregnant, and she looks really upset, and he's going, "Come on, come on." And he's very sort of aggressive presence, and we just drift on by. You know, there's a million, what was that line from The Naked City? There's a million stories in the naked city. And it's still true. It'll always be true. And we just we have little windows, little peepholes into other people's stories. This is a moment I love in the film. I passed these two girls, and I was actually, I would only film if the vehicle was moving between 30 or 40 miles an hour. So my way of being invisible was to shoot past so fast that nobody had the chance to see me, except people occasionally would see me. It was mostly children and African-American males, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. But these kids were wonderful, and I was actually going pretty slowly past them. And if the car wasn't moving fast enough to give me the kind of thing I wanted, I would just crank the camera around and do like a synthetic movement, just a big, like a pan. I didn't have much movement because the thing was so big, and but I had a little bit. We were going slowly. The girls saw me, and at the first moment, they're delighted. It's like they're just fascinated by this thing that's happening in front of them. And then instantly, I call it the going from innocence to experience shot. She suddenly goes into this whole New York kid thing where she looks at the camera and she goes like this. And she follows us around as we go by. And she just keeps her eye locked into the camera. And it's riveting. It's a moment of being implicated. What can I say? I like these guys. The soundtrack for the film, I had wanted to make the soundtrack somehow a kind of sonic equivalent to revealing something about the street that this camera revealed about what I saw, things that happened so quickly that the eye can't see them. And I tried a number of different things. I tried slowing sound down, but it just became so kind of heavy, it just made the whole thing drag. I tried driving fast through the streets with a shotgun mic out the window, picking up fragments of conversation. That didn't work, and then I was doing some editing, and there was some music going, and I realized that music, which is something I didn't want to do, really worked. So I asked Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth to do some music, because I knew that he would do a great job. And he played a 12-string guitar, just improvised. And I wanted it to be a solo musical track, because what I get from this film, after looking at it, as I have done many times, although I still see people I've never seen before in it, is this feeling of being, difficult to put it without sounding kind of hokey or something. But for a moment you exist inside everybody's mind. It's like somehow you see people's thoughts shooting this fast by them. And you exist for a moment inside in this cast of thousands throughout the film, throughout the city. And I wanted the soundtrack to be one person doing one thing and just kind of moving in their own way. And Thurston did this improvisation on the 12-string guitar, which has a lovely sort of, I don't know, he can make it sound like a symphony orchestra, but very beautiful, melancholic kind of sounds. And it's just one person improvising in their own mind and traveling a path, a kind of interior path, which is a kind of parallel path to the meanderings that I made as I drove around the city to shoot the film. That's probably enough for me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation. As Brian mentioned, I have a book related to this topic that came out just a few months ago. I even have a visual of it for you. And this book set out to pose the question of what happens if a certain kind of street photography, and Brian alluded to it in his opening remarks, what happens if a certain kind of street photography is temporarily set aside and we were allowed to think about the street as a deeply informative place for photographic practice. And so to sketch that out a little bit, and to use the same two people that Brian referenced in his opening remarks, Cartier-Bresson or Gary Winogrand, a certain kind of photography that I can illustrate for you. Sort of goes like this. It's usually a man walking down the street with a handheld camera, usually a 35 millimeter, snapping away pretty intensely, one frame after another, until you arrive at a moment where everything seems to align. It's part formal consideration, it's part expression, it's part gesture, and this is the street photography that came to be celebrated 50 years ago. This is the street photography that relies on incident, happenstance, everyday occurrence, things that try to reveal something about daily life in the city. What I'm interested in is a group of photographers who have made photographs on those same city streets, but are deeply interested in the streets themselves as the location for the making of these photographs. So the book brought together 4 different photographers as case studies. And the first of these was Richard Avedon. I consider his photographs that he made in Paris starting in 1947, so just after World War II. And I consider the way in which those photographs, which are so often categorized as fashion photographs, right? Not street photographs, but fashion photographs. But those photographs are indicative of someone really carefully using Paris and its city streets to change the way in which not only his pictures were made, but the way in which they were consumed by people reading the fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar here in the United States. And I'll just show you 2 examples. And my hope is that by bringing together people who are otherwise very easily labeled a fashion photographer or a photojournalist or a conceptual artist or an art photographer, a different kind of dialogue is sparked about what it means to take a camera into the street, especially when there's this high level of attention to the location of making. You might think of it as a kind of site-specific street photography. My second case study is Charles Moore. Charles Moore is was a photojournalist working for the Black Star Agency. He is in Birmingham in May of 1963 when the civil rights demonstrations, a week's worth of civil rights demonstrations turn quite ugly. And he takes some of the most famous images of those demonstrations that are then published in Life magazine the subsequent week. Here you see the Birmingham Fire Department turning high-pressured hoses on demonstrators huddled on the sidewalk. And this image is actually the opening spread in Life magazine for the resulting photo essay. Here's another example. The Birmingham demonstrations, for those of you who might not be familiar with them, really mark a pivotal turning point. The fire hoses and the dog attacks were seen nationwide. They were seen internationally. They came to the attention of the president, and they really were a kind of a tipping point in the way in which the civil rights causes were perceived, because there had just been such enormous aggression in the use of the fire hoses and the dogs. And all that's interesting, but I also wanted to link it to this decade in which, you know, we talk about the 60s as this decade of taking it to the streets and this decade of demonstration, and it's known for that. But I challenge any of you to find a book on street photography that shows even one demonstration photograph. They just don't exist. It's been written out of the history of the genre as we've come to inherit it. So for 50 years, we've talked about street photography, and we've never talked about one of the times when people come together in the streets to occupy, to demonstrate, to protest, and to advocate for change. The third of the four case studies is Martha Rossler's project, The Bowery and Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems. This is a project that she photographs over the winter of 1974-1975 along the Bowery. She was living in the East Village at the time and was literally walking down the Bowery, which, like many of the neighborhoods that PL and James have referenced, was a very different Bowery than today. It was very much down and out. It was populated most heavily with a drunk homeless population that Martha Rossler was interested in not exploiting in her photographs, sort of the exact antithesis of using those people to document the circumstances of the Bowery. And so I'm fascinated by this project because it strips the human element or the human representation out of the street photograph. So what you're left with is, you know, empty bottles, broken bottles in the lower right, and then the original concept for the piece, Martha Rossler wanted to be sure that the images were always paired with text, so that the human element was conjured, but it wasn't an exploitative representation of this population that lived and slept on the Bowery. So here on the left, you have, again, a photograph where there's this sort of pair of shoes standing in for someone, and on the right, you have her textual component, which is a whole series of words associated with drunkenness. And that's the two inadequate descriptive systems of her title, this idea that neither the pictures nor the words can do justice to representing the Bowery, but the two of them together create a tension that tells us something about this very particular location in New York City. And the fourth chapter is on Philip-Lorca diCorcia, the same two bodies of work that he spoke about today: Street Work, which is in the 90s, and then Heads, which starts in 99 and debuts in 2001. And I wanted to make sure to include this image because in the background of this image, you get to see what was referenced earlier, this transformation of Times Square. So this photograph is made at a moment when all of those storefronts on the far side of the street have been shuttered, And until the major transformations happen, they paint them these bright, festive colors to make it somehow more appealing that all these businesses are being driven out of the area. And I can let PL say more about it, but he had a history, he was engaged with this neighborhood, he shot this neighborhood regularly, and made photographs of the very particular kinds of businesses that were being driven out, the sort of porn palaces and adult video stores and so on and so forth. And then, of course, by the time we get to Heads, this is also a favorite image of mine. You have this very sanitized, almost unidentifiable version of Times Square, where a gaggle of teenage girls can roam freely, and that transformation, which happens in less than a decade, is something that I felt Philip-Lorca diCorcia's photographs really encapsulated. And again, this idea that there was such attention to what was happening in Times Square and what transformations were being wrought there. And the way that his two different projects reveal that, to me, was the really compelling nature of these photographs. I also wanted to end the book with someone who had really, since his very first monograph, been embraced as this person who was the light of hope for the continuation of street photography as a genre. So I very purposefully selected this work because it had been seen as something that could be folded into that narrative of the other kind of street photography, the happenstance and the more detached from location kind of street photography. And I wanted to try to argue that something different was going on here, that yes, it is true that really great moments are captured in these photographs, and they can be celebrated for that, but they can also tell us a lot about what was changing in the city, particularly Times Square at that moment. And that's my last slide.
So I just wanted to ask, how you came to see the strobe light as something that could help you with photographs that you made in the street. Did you have an aha moment about that? Was it for you the availability of high-speed cameras and high-definition cameras that caused you to revisit, making street films again, or just talk a little bit about the genesis of the two projects, and then we can go on from there to some of the implications.
Well, I don't know who you... Just jump in whenever you want. I always used strobes, so it wasn't really like an addition. It was just a different usage of the same thing, which had something to do, strangely enough, though I don't think Katherine, she starts out with Richard Avedon. The artificiality of imagery was part of the postmodern dialogue, which I kind of grew up on. And the fact that it is not what you think it is, picking up on something that is a program that you repeat over and over again. There is no difference between day one and the last day I did any of that work in terms of what I actually did. And that might seem sort of cynical or manipulative, but that was kind of the point.
It was an 8-hour-a-day or a 6-hour-a-day day job.
Yeah. Well, I had to work in the middle of the day, so there was a lot of people around, and they don't talk to you because they're too busy, but yes.
And James?
I forgot the question.
It was about sort of the technical aspect of the camera and what it can, whether it led you to kind of come...
I remember. I guess what we all do is it's a kind of continuum of one thing just slipping into the next. Like, that's what you do as an artist, and you take a bit of this, you take a bit of that, and then you put them together in this way, and then you put them together in another way. You're just shifting things around all the time. And I'd been working with high-speed cameras for a while, but mostly 16 millimeter. And I had a really kind of funky collection of... I put a bid on something called usgovernment.com for their the entire high-speed laboratory of the University of Tennessee. And I put on a $250 bid in the middle of the night. And next thing I knew, I owned this thing. And so I dispatched a friend of mine with a truck to go and pick it all up. And he showed up. It was very funny. These guys he was loading up the van, and these guys kept saying, God, you got to thank your friend. Thank him so much for taking this stuff. And anyway, he showed up. But there were some great cameras in there. There were sort of gun cameras and things, which, you play around with things and you see what happens. I'd been interested in fragments of time. My paintings are really just fragments of time. They're like photographs, actually. They're made in the same kind of time frame as a photograph. One brushstroke, 2 or 3 seconds. Although I do them over and over until I get the right one. It's a little bit like Walker Evans stalking his prey, Actually, I had a great opportunity when I did that show at the Met, and they asked me to curate the show to go with the film. I'd never curated anything before, and I understood immediately the joy of curating something, because you get to, it's a creative act itself. You get all these things, but I got to look at all the Walker Evans negatives, because they have the whole estate up there, and the contact sheets, and you can see him stalking, From one way he gets a little closer, he goes down, he goes up, and then he gets it, just like you were saying. So I knew the possibilities of the high-speed camera. I was also very taken, always, with what they're called actuality films, from like the turn of the last century, when they would just mount a camera on the front of a trolley car or something and drive through the streets of one city. And, no editing, no attempt made to manipulate what happened in front of the camera. And then they'd take that film and, they'd shoot New York and show it in Chicago for people who had never been to New York. You got to see what New York looked like. And they would shoot San Francisco and show it in New York. But I think the most famous is that one, San Francisco before and after the earthquake, where the guy went down Market Street, and then 3 days later the earthquake happens, where he went down again, and there's dead horses, and it's a very different kind of scene. But I like that unmanipulative use of film. And there was just one more thing I wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, really, it's something that people figured out that you could take something that was sort of unmanipulated, and then in the editing you could manipulate it into saying whatever you wanted. And nobody really picked up on the beauty of showing things the way they happen to be until Andy Warhol, of all people, turned his 16mm camera on his friends and just watched them. So that's always been a big inspiration of mine, too.
Kate, maybe you can also speak a little bit to this question as our resident art historian, and also somebody who's written about, photographers from earlier generations. Maybe you can speak about the availability of 35mm cameras and how that changes the types of photographs that are made in urban sites earlier in the 20th century.
Sure, I can speak a little bit about that. It's the advent of the 35mm is transformative, and certainly most surveys on street photography really dwell on that, because it allowed this presence in the street that was less cumbersome technologically speaking, and just in terms of the amount of equipment that anyone was dragging out into the street. You know, it's not a dissimilar point to the one that's made about, you know, the availability of handheld film cameras, you know, for sort of the new wave, you know, this kind of gritty filming that was made possible by that technological development. But I think one of the things that I wanted to do in the book, and that I do in every chapter in the book, was, you know, to say that although the 35 millimeter camera enabled a certain kind of photographic practice, there are also all these other practices that were not as reliant on it, or added elements to it. So, you know, I loved that. I loved that you know, both Avedon and diCorcia were using supplemental lighting for their street photography. I loved that that Charles Moore is using 35 millimeter camera, but he's doing it in a way where he actually has multiple cameras around his neck at any given time, because he's shooting so fast that he has to have them effectively preset in order to shoot different scenes as they unfold, that there's not time to sort of refocus or recalibrate anything. So this idea that he's using multiple cameras. So I very consciously talk about process rather than sort of set it aside as something that doesn't have to do with the end result. Even though a huge part of my interest is in the end result and how people came to see these photographs, how they came to be known, and how they circulated.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that you have two examples up here of people who do exactly the opposite. They just make it more difficult to take
Right.
a photograph. I mean, it's like I've never used 35 millimeter
Right.
cameras, or digital cameras for that matter. You know, I just make it more difficult to make it. And James does as well. It's just big, cumbersome, sort of limiting in a way. And those limits are what is the challenge. And because you're already working in a medium and a photographic dialogue that is saturated. And so what do you bring to it? As he kind of explained, you don't bring anything to it because there's nobody that's waiting for it. I mean, now we're talking, you know, past tense, but when you actually have to do the thing, there's nobody that is like, you know, at your doorstep saying, you know, how'd it go? You just come home and that's it. So, I don't know, there is a huge history of street photography, and it all seems to have the common denominator of some response. But in fact, the two people you have sitting up on the stage, or whatever this thing is, actually I don't think have any capability to respond. I mean, how fast could you react in their van or SUV? I can't react anyway. I mean, you know, they come through the space, you know, I get lucky or I don't, and that's it. And by the way, that's a huge part of photography. You get lucky.
Do you think perhaps that
Pharrell.
both of you, having sort of set up these limitations for yourselves or working in ways that are more cumbersome, in some way also allowed you to make the work in the first place? You both sort of hinted at in 2014, there are sort of these legal and social difficulties that pretend to, you know, taking images in urban environments. The fact that you were there with a big camera, and that sort of gave you an invisibility, or it made you less at the time, as if you were sort of furtively snapping and doing something that could be misconstrued as invasive, allowed that work to happen. And perhaps also with you, you emphasized moving at 30 to 40 miles an hour through the street. The city mayor's office didn't seem to care that much, but if you were doing something akin to what Winogrand was doing now, somebody in Times Square, some burly cop might say, hey, what's going on?
I think PL nailed it, that luck is an enormous part of the equation, but luck isn't something that just exists on its own. Luck is something that happens when you set something in motion. And as an artist, you figure out, it's your decision what to set in motion, and you choose your tools and your camera and your film and your lighting and equipment and everything else, and then you let it go. If you didn't let it go, nothing would happen.
Yeah,
and
that's the worst question you can be asked. What are you doing next?
Let it be known that I didn't actually ask that.
But, yeah, you let it happen, I suppose. But, I mean, yeah, is that an action or a lack of action?
Yes.
Well, in the end...
I mean, at the same time, like when I was shooting out of this vehicle, I was traveling fast. And the camera has an ability to shoot, the kind of frame rate that I was shooting at, I could shoot for 6 seconds maximum. So I had to choose the timing had to be very precise. And if I saw something that I would see something coming from up the block, or when I say something, I mean like a group of people or, a possibility, and decide that I wanted to shoot it. And as we roared past, the light's changing the whole time as you drive through the city. Like as you go past one block, sunlight comes in and then you're in the shadows. So you had to kind of factor in a lot of things very quickly. Focal length, everything. All the little decisions about what kind of picture you were going to take had to be done very quickly. And it required a kind of teamwork between me and the other guys in the van.
And then at the end, it also requires, perhaps like these artists of previous generations who are working through their contact sheets, a very rigorous process of editing. Yeah. I think you took 3,000 photographs to come up with the 17. One thing you said is you didn't like normal people. Nobody likes normal people. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what you were looking for. You said it's difficult to make a different picture in another context rather than a good picture. Maybe you can speak. I know that you shot, I think, 16 hours.
I shot 16 hours, and actually in the proposal that I made, it all comes to the same thing in the end. In my proposal, I said that I was not looking for spectacular events. I was looking for the ordinary and the mundane, because I knew that this camera could reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary and mundane. And that, like in my film, just like a shift of the eyes becomes a major dramatic moment. So, I mean, I wasn't avoiding things either, but what I was really looking for was ordinary.
I started that project, working on the street, after doing all this work in which I told everybody exactly what to do. They have to look that way, twist their head, stand over there. It was all programmed. There were Polaroids that set it all up. I knew exactly what it was going to look like. And then I just decided I didn't want that anymore. And that seemed also part of the practice that I was investigating, because I am of the generation that investigated its own medium. And I was very happy to be released from making all the decisions. It's one of the great things about working on the street. There's so many, we're not, by the way, well, whoever's out there that works as an assistant, they're invaluable as well. And I think that's how I started out. That's why, I kind of relate to fashion in a way, because it's a system in which you have to have an assistant, you have to have prep, you have to, preordain, most of what you do. That's almost liberating. You would think that having nothing to control the situation is liberating. But actually what's liberating is having total control. And working on the street is not, you can't really control it. It's much of a program that I can apply to the situation. I don't control it. And whatever the gap is that gets filled in by happenstance is actually the reward for me.
So maybe this issue of control leads into some thornier questions that relate to things that are going on in the city today and how cameras are used in them and issues of surveillance and things like that. And I wonder, maybe Kate, you've sort of looked across the century and you've got case studies that are at specific moments in time. So I wonder if street photography, as we tend to think of it conventionally, and as it's decreasingly being practiced in part because of the changes that are going on in society, is it coming to an end? Are we going to be left with street-style portrait photographs on blogs on the one hand, and then surveillance camera footage on the other?
I think that's a great question, and I'm kind of waiting to see what happens, because I think it is a very different moment now. And in that sense, I have to say that, you know, it felt very right to end the book with Heads, which, as PL said, has had, without his intention, has had this layer of political, psychological, sort of memorialization layered onto it because of the events that surrounded the debut of that work. And I think we're still figuring out what it's going to look like. But I do think that there's less and less that I'm seeing that looks like this historical model, and more that looks like something involving parameters, which is not quite the word that you're both using, but I think is what you're suggesting, or involves control. And it still can be in the service of the lucky moment, or still can be in the service of the ordinary, but that it's being structured differently, and that the process that artists are using to go about making those pictures is different. I mean, that you thought to go to the mayor's office, which, you know, when you were rolling a concrete ball down the exit ramp of the West Side Highway, I know you were not going to the mayor's office to ask for permission or get any red flags for what that might mean. So there's a way in which your practice has been changed by the current situation that we live in.
I don't think the mayor's office even asks you what you're doing. I never went there myself. I should just send somebody up there, because if you use a tripod, that's the thing. That's the point at which they get on your ass. So I just had the permit, and the permit never was questioned by a policeman. It was questioned by some guy from a construction site. It was like, what are you doing on our property? Well, it's not your property, it's a public street. Yeah, but we're building a building right here. Yeah, well, so what? And you show them the permit, and they're like, okay, cool. You know, it's almost like your badge. But no policeman ever asked me. And now it's completely different. Like, they copyright images of the World Trade Center, or, well, not World Trade Center anymore, but Empire State Building. If you use that in any sort of sense that they can nail you for, they'll sue you. They own it. They own the images of New York City.
Can I ask a question in another way? Go ahead. Okay. I just want to ask a question another way, because you've also traveled to make street work in other cities around the world. Is this a very New York, or is this a very U.S. question and series of concerns that necessarily hasn't also come to pass in other places in the world where maybe either of you have worked? You know, I can imagine that the sort of levels of institutional and municipal control might not be the same in other parts of the world.
I think people are different. I mean, I think everybody knows I got sued. And, you know, that was about a lot of different elements. But, you know, it took a long time and a lot of courts to get over that guy suing me. And in New York, nobody ever asked me anything. But like in Germany, everybody they would stop me and say, "Don't take my photograph." You know, just they preempted me.
People who were walking down the sidewalk towards
They
you.
could see what I was doing, and they would tap me and say, like, "I'm walking through your photograph here, and don't do it."
I
That
think
only happened in Germany.
I think we still live in a very free society here in New York. Like whatever we worry about surveillance cameras and the kind of chilliness coming down, it's still pretty amazing. Like compared to London, London has a security camera on every building looking at you, it seems. And you can't walk through London without having your entire passageway noted by somebody. And but I was thinking, like in terms of the kind of ubiquity of the photographic image, when I look at my kids who communicate with, Instagram and all these other kinds of things, they communicate in terms of images. And in as much as street photography is a record of life lived, there's a strong connect there of, I know it's a different discussion, I guess, but it connects too that.
Does that become a version of what you were describing earlier as actuality films?
In a way, yeah.
And my
Except
son's
they're good
21.
poses.
He doesn't he's too cool for Instagram. All that stuff is for kids, basically. Nobody cares about Facebook anymore. I mean, it's a business and I guess it's a great thing for social activism.
Yeah, but like my daughter, Sasha, who's a photographer,
Yeah.
she was gonna take her portfolio around and show it to people. And I said, "Well, did you think about printing some of the photos?" And she said, "No, I didn't think about printing." They're like, "What do I want to print them for? I'll just bring my computer." And
Well, that's
I
a funny
understand
thing
that.
about photography. I mean, it's this, look, we're looking at a different version of the norm. Like this is like how many sizes are here? And is it a C print? Is it an inkjet print? Is it going to last forever? Is it going to be gone tomorrow? All of these are weird, tangential issues, but issues that do come up in the practice of photography because it's a commodity that people sell. And they want to know all that stuff.
So perhaps I can ask you a question about the specific decisions that led to the prints of your street photographs, which are 48 by 60 inches. They're Fujicolor Crystal Archive prints. What about that
Whoa.
scale? I've been looking at my exhibition's checklist a lot lately. Is there something about that scale that for you was meant to sort of foster a one-to-one scale interaction? I know that at the Met your film was projected quite large. Maybe there's something about that you can.
Size does matter.
Okay.
scale too. My film, I have pretty precise instructions about the size and the kind of projector and all those sort of things, because it makes a difference to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I want it to be not more than about 14 inches, like the bottom of the screen, about 14 inches off the ground, so that you have the feeling that you could kind of step into it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And a certain size and shape and lumens and all that kind of stuff. But I'm pretty specific about it.
You know, sometimes these things work backwards. It's like you got a hole to fill. And, you know, this size works. I mean, I've only done one projection. And it wasn't done, it was here in New York, but, I mean, it ended up here. But it was done for a space in Paris. And it just, that was the size, because that was the size of the room.
Yeah. That's the scale part of it.
Yeah.
Like,
Kate, some of the artists that you, or some of the photographers that you describe in your book are obviously working through very different distribution cycles.
Right.
Their images are sent through magazines or communicated to people through magazines, or with Martha Rosler, perhaps it was meant to be almost like a book or a magazine essay project. Can you speak a little bit about maybe how that impacted the nature of the photographs themselves, knowing that they were going to be, at relatively small scale?
Sure. You've just sort of outlined, there's sort of, I would say, there's a divide between the first two case studies and the last two case studies. The first two case studies, the imagined use or end result of the photographs is absolutely the printed page. And so there's a huge awareness on the photographer's part about the format. So Charles Moore is aware of what a two-page spread in Life magazine looks like.
And what kind of picture succeeds in that format?
Exactly, and by the same token, I showed at least one vertical by Richard Avedon. He's thinking again about what one page in the magazine looks like. For Rosler's project, she's been very clear that project, because it was meant to critique a history of documentary photography, much of which was based on the street, always set out with an art audience as its intended viewers. So for her, the circulation of those images initially relied on slide lectures that she would give. The book is published not that long after. It includes other projects as well, but the book version is published, and she's very clear about the sequencing of that. But she really always wanted those prints to hang on a museum wall, so I don't have an image of it to show you. But for those of you who haven't seen the Bowery installed, that sort of pairing I showed you of the photographic element and the text element, there's a sequence of those that is very specific and is gridded on a wall in a museum, and each of those elements is a modestly scaled photographic print, including, I should say, the text pieces. Those are not, they're typewritten, but then she photographed them. So everything that's presented is a photographic print. I can only imagine that, resources being tight, which is something that has come up again and again, there's actually not that many versions of the piece. I know of two, both in public collections. So that was always her end goal, but it wasn't like she had the means to do 15 versions of it like you might see today and edition it and distribute it through a gallery system. So it was speculatively for the art world. And then the same, by the time Piel's making these photographs, as he said, he had an established history of making photographs, and it was clear, that these photographs were going to be shown in galleries and museums long before these had been made. So there is a difference in how these images appeared.
I think there's this. It's a kind of tangential issue, but there was a point at which everybody that did photographs wanted to distance themselves from photography in the art world. Like, whatever. You start with Cindy Sherman, end with Gursky, but it's like, I am not a photographer. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that they did this was through scale. The whole Dusseldorf School of Photography is just giant. Clearly try to distinguish themselves from photography, even though that's what they do. So, scale has taken on other proportions because it's a market factor.
I wonder if that's another way of inflecting the question about, are we coming to the end of a historical moment with a certain type of street photography and it will melt back out into the streets or into other distribution channels? Maybe not necessarily Instagram, but other printed sources and other publications, more so than it ends up naturally in the walls, on the walls of the museum. There have been a number of street photography shows over the last, let's say, decade, surveys, and maybe this is marking the end of a moment where that's sort of a viable interest on the part of people who are doing museum and art historical scholarship.
Well, I mean, I actually want to sort of pose a question to you, Brian. I mean, we're sitting in this room with these works, and you alluded to their appearance in Cincinnati during the photography festival, but it's not in one location. It doesn't sound like it's going to be sort of fine art prints like what we're seeing here. So can you say something more about that? Because that is the kind of move that seems interesting and different in comparison maybe to some of the works that you'll be including on the walls of your museum.
Well, first let me disclaim it. The Rinaldi project is one that's being put together by Artworks, which is a different organization. It's a public art organization in Cincinnati, kind of like Creative Time here. And they had a very successful project last year in which artists and photographers made works that were then distributed or presented throughout the city on bus shelters. And I think this is a natural project to sort of go along those lines. And from what I understand, Rinaldi's photographs have also been presented, for example, on, I think it's called like construction hoarding, or sort of in large public places. It's in Toronto right now for another photography festival. Maybe there's something about this work itself that lends itself to being displayed publicly by virtue of the fact that he's tried to foster interactions between people who are themselves and could very well be passing through the spaces in which those photographs are depicted. For me, when thinking of some of the ideas behind this show, there were so many surveys. There was one at Tate about 10 years ago, and there was one in Milwaukee, and there have been others. The National Gallery did one in 2008. There have been museum shows that have been dedicated to the kind of these conventional understandings of street photography. But I was interested in a number of artists who I wouldn't naturally rope into that category, but then when I put them all on a list on a sheet of paper in front of me, who might I want to work with in this new capacity as a curator at a museum, that was one of the sort of threads that linked it. And for me also then to think about the pervasiveness of cameras in city streets, it's something that I just read about. You mentioned that in London it's especially pervasive. There was a brilliant essay 10 years ago by Andrew O'Hagan in the London Review of Books about closed-circuit TV and the cameras that are just an everyday part of life in cities there. That was the connection, and so then it becomes, can you try to reimagine a genre that, as we're all saying, has been surveyed so endlessly and has such a conventional understanding of it. But then I'm still presenting them in a museum, so maybe it behooves me to, I don't know, get a giant wall in Cincinnati and start projecting things onto it, or making posters. I am working on a billboard project, but that's entirely separate, so.
There's the one phrase that came up a lot in the court cases is expectation of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And in a public place, there is no expectation of privacy. So, like, people who complain about the fact that there are cameras everywhere, or that you're part of that problem, they have no expectation legally, and probably shouldn't, simply because, well, in London, everybody knows. You never see those guys with the weird hats and, a gun in London. You just never do. Because they have cameras everywhere. That's their system. And it's expected that if something happens within a minute or two, somebody will be dispatched to save your ass. And that's how many cameras are around.
There is, in my exhibition, I'll make one plug for it. There's an artist named Jill Majid who's made a work in Liverpool 10 years ago in which she collaborated with the police officers who operate the CCTV cameras. And she got them on the phone, and she would close her eyes and walk through Liverpool, and he would watch her from camera to camera to camera as she turned around corners saying, don't step into the street, there's a car coming, veer to the right, She was placing her trust in this system of kind of pervasive networked surveillance.
Well, maybe there's a kind of freedom in no privacy.
Perhaps, but I guess the last question that I wanted to ask before opening this up to questions from the audience or broader conversation is, with this expectation that there is no longer any sense of privacy in public places, and maybe also there's less privacy in private places even, does that, you made mention, you used the word dignity about the interaction, does that very fact kind of condition or degrade the possibility of there being dignity in the interaction between people who are using cameras and hoping to make good pictures and the possible subjects who might be passing through their zone of focus or that they're trying to capture? Is that just something that, as a possibility, is more difficult now because we're all conditioned by this Skynet?
I don't know.
You know, I wouldn't want anybody to do to me what I've done to other people.
It's true, but except that you kind of liberate, you know, that the rabbi coming out of the subway, you kind of liberated him in a way too.
Yeah. I think he's
I
dead.
mean it.
He's very liberated.
I know one thing which is interesting for me, which was that I have showed my film in a few different places, and one of them, they asked me to show it at Sundance. And I thought, great, Sundance, yeah, you know. And they showed it, they said, why don't we show it in the street? And I thought, well, I don't know if I'd really want to see it seen in the street, but, you know, it's Sundance, and, you know, a lot of people will see it, and so I agreed to it, and it looked terrible. And you couldn't see that, you know, like, there was, it was kind of like it was so obvious to show street in the street. It was kind of like a no-brainer, but it destroyed it because my film needs to be removed from the street in order to really get it.
Give us a view onto it.
It needs a quiet place where you can see this, and it's a funny sort of irony of the whole business.